In our last lecture, we examined the thought of Bernard Manville, and we saw that Manville's philosophy supported the moral secularism and materialism that characterized the Enlightenment as it reacted against received Christian and scholastic tradition. In this lecture, we're going to examine one of the Enlightenment's most profound critics, and that is Bishop George Berkley, who opposed the rising metaphysic of the Enlightenment, that metaphysic being mechanistic materialism, precisely because he thought it resulted in the growth of both skepticism and, even worse, atheism and libertinism. Now, Berkeley's an interesting figure. He's one of the first spokesmen for a metaphysical posture known as absolute idealism, an extremely abstract and abstruse doctrine, but one that's nonetheless important, particularly in the 19th century. And it's for that reason that we'll be looking at Berkeley in the 18th, because he not only allows us to see a criticism of the Enlightenment, one of the rising sense of reaction against its excesses, but also because, as an empiricist, he gives us a sort of easy way of getting at idealism. We're going to look in particular at four issues. First, how does Berkeley deploy Lockean empiricism? And we'll see this with regards to one issue, how he refutes the Lockean doctrine of abstract ideas. Secondly, we'll look at his critique of materialism and what he offers in its stead, his argument for idealism. Then our third issue will be to examine how he uses idealism to support a pietistic worldview. And then finally, we'll examine some of, at least for Berkeley, what were the benefits of idealism or an idealist philosophy. But let's start with that first issue, Berkeley's deployment of the Lockean empiricist phenomenology and epistemology. You'll recall from Professor Core's lecture that Locke viewed the mind of an infant as a tabula rasa, a blank slate, by which he meant that all of our ideas and all of our knowledge arises from sense experience. And this was, of course, where he dissented from the 17th century rationalist position, which had believed in innate ideas. Okay. We'll see that Berkeley not only adopts that Lockean position of tabula rasa, and with it the empiricist phenomenology or epistemology, but was in fact probably even more rigorous and adept at deploying it than Locke had been. And the example we're going to look at is the treatment of abstract ideas. Now, what are abstract ideas and what is the issue involved? It has to do with what the medievals called the problem of the universals. There are certain terms in our language which don't seem to name individual entities. They refer to what we might call general concepts or classes of entities. Think of the word humanity or mankind. Think of the word justice or the word beauty. How are we to interpret such words? Now, the tradition that Plato had argued for, if you'll recall, was the realist position, that those words refer to real entities. And if we don't come across them in our physical experience, then we should expect to find them in some other realm, perhaps a metaphysical realm. And that's called realism. Universal terms have real reference. We today don't debate the issue of universals, but we do it in an attenuated form with respect to numbers. So that's a good way for you to think about it. Do things like 1, 2, and 3 refer to real objects or not? If you are a realist, you think in some sense, metaphysically, there exist numbers. Now, Locke had rejected that tradition, or that position of realism, in favor of what he called conceptualism. And that treated universals as nominal essences, or as Berkeley calls them, abstract ideas, rather than real subsistent entities. So his notion is, you don't actually come across a 1, a 2, or a 3. You don't come across a universal humanity, beauty, or justice. But you can form those universal concepts in your mind on the basis of your particular experiences. And therefore, we would argue that such entities exist only in your mind and not in the world. And that's a sort of middle ground between realism on the one hand and the very radical position we'll see Berkeley takes, which is nominalism. And indeed, we'll see that Berkeley criticized such abstract ideas as a half-hearted compromise with realism. Instead, he insisted on a thoroughgoing reduction to particular sense experience, and that results in what we'll call nominalism. Okay. In brief, nominalism means that universal terms are just names that name nothing in specific. If anything, they refer to classes of entities. But what I want to do is show you how Berkeley uses the Lockean empiricist phenomenology to destroy Locke's idea of abstract ideas. Okay. Begin with this assumption. If all of our ideas arise, as Locke had argued, either directly or indirectly, from our impressions or sense datum, of which they are presumably copies, then it's impossible for us, Berkeley will argue, to have an abstract idea, because all of our sense datum are always particular. Again, since our ideas are what we might call mental representations, or pictures, if you will, images, then to have an abstract idea would be to have an abstract image or representation. So take that notion of man. If you were to form an image or representation of a man that was neither white nor black or any other pigmentation, neither tall nor short, neither male nor female, neither clothed nor unclothed, neither heavy nor thin, Berkeley would argue if you can form such a concept in your mind, you probably are suffering from some form of mental illness. Right? In reality, all of our images, all of our representations are always particular. So it's impossible for the mind to create such an image or picture in the imagination. Any attempt to do so is illusory. Okay. Well, I want to turn from that now to that second issue I had raised, which is the critique of materialism and the argument for idealism. Berkeley argued that if you're going to be consistent in your empiricism, if you're going to take that argument that all of our ideas are reducible to sense, we cannot avoid the conclusion that the only phenomena of which we are immediately aware are our ideas. And if you remember what Locke meant by ideas, as Professor Kors explained it, they are phenomenal experiences, experiences of immediate sense from our five-sense datum. And we'll see that Berkeley tries to argue that given that immediate experience from your five-sense datum, the argument from that to materialism is in fact a dogmatic superstition. And that as a result of that, we must conclude that matter is in fact what he called an occult substratum, or a metaphysical dogma. And this doctrine that Berkeley is taking, we'll see, is known as absolute idealism. Let me present the argument to you in some detail. If all of the sensible objects of which we are aware are comprised of ideas derived from sense, presumably from sense, then this podium would be made up of a set of discrete sense phenomena for us. The various colors that we see when we look at it from various angles, the smooth textures of its side, perhaps the sounds produced by rapping on it. Presumably we wouldn't engage in olfactory inspection or taste, but if we needed to, perhaps we could. And that's what makes up the sum of our idea of this object. Similarly, if I was to point out this rather handsome coffee mug, it would be made up of a sum of sense experiences, the smooth textures on the outside, the range of colors that you experience when you look at it, its particular weight, etc., etc. Note that when we look at both the lectern and the coffee mug, we find that we never actually experience matter, right? We experience, again, smooth textures, colors, etc., but never matter. And then the question is, how did we ever get an idea of matter? Remember, Locke had argued that all of our ideas must be derivable from sense. So then we're left with the question, how did we derive the idea of matter from sense? And this is an interesting question. What color is matter? What flavor is it? What does it feel like? And of course, matter has no particular flavor, has no particular odor, no particular texture, no particular sound, no particular color. And for that very reason, it can't really be reduced to sensual experience. Well, what Berkeley shows is that matter is in fact a posit. It's a conjecture we make to explain what unifies the various set of sense experiences we find in objects. So we look at an object like a coffee mug or like a lectern, we see it's made up of a variety of sensible particulars, and we decide that there must be something which they hang on or which unifies them, hence matter. But since it's never sensed, matter that is, and since sensual objects are, for Berkley, really not unified so much by this substratum of matter, but by constant conjunction. And again, that's an important point which he's going to argue, and we'll see developed in Hume as well, that what in fact unifies our experience of the lectern is the fact that the various ranges of colors, textures, and sounds produced by rapping all always coincide with your experience of this particular lectern, similarly with the coffee mug, that we don't in fact need to posit matter to hold these objects together, material objects. We could simply reduce them to the sum of particular sensual experiences we have with them. If that's the case, then what Berkley is going to do is apply something known as Occam's razor. And this is a very sharp piece of turnabout. William of Ockham had been a medieval English philosopher who is in some ways one of the fathers of empiricism, and he had argued the following principle. If I could explain phenomena X with 4 different entities posited to explain it, and you can explain phenomena X with 3 posited entities, they're both equally consistent, they're both equally coherent. The 3-part argument is always superior to the 4-part. And that's called applying Occam's razor, simply eliminating those entities, arguments, or premises that are not absolutely necessary. Well, applying Occam's razor then to the phenomenal construction of objects in everyday experience leads to the elimination of matter. We simply say that objects are the conjunction of discrete sensual experiences. So if all of our sensual objects, or sensible objects, in this case, don't really need matter to support them, right? I mean, the argument he's making is we posit matter as something that these sense datum can hang on. But if we don't have to do that, then all we have left are ideas. Hence, idealism, right? That the only thing we actually experience and need posit are those ideas. But not quite the only thing. Ideas themselves need a substratum. They must be lodged someplace. And it's obvious that there's only one place an idea can be lodged. Obviously in the human mind. So, what does that leave us with in our universe? We have a universe of ideas in minds. And thus all of the objects of experience in the universe are ideas in minds. Okay. Now, Berkley extended this critique beyond just what we might call primary secondary qualities, those of immediate sense, to primary qualities as well. He was able to demonstrate that shape, motion, magnitude are also things which are constructed from sense and therefore not necessarily part of the fabric of the universe prior to our experience of it. But I want to move on to what I think is probably a more abstruse and important notion, how he deploys his idealism to prove his pietistic agenda. All right, let's grant that Berkley has argued for an empiricist absolute idealism. What he wants to prove from that is such a position entails the existence of God. And that it is God in this case, and not Newtonian mechanics, that accounts for the law-like regularity of our ideas. All right, how does this argument work? Well, first of all, we know that all of the objects of the world are ideas and minds. Add to that the following observation Berkley makes. We have 2 classes of ideas, right? We have those ideas of which we are aware producing, that we produce ourselves. You look at this lectern, you close your eyes, you form an image of it in your mind. That idea or image you produced yourself. Looking at that phenomena, you say, minds produce ideas. But there are other ideas you have, or impressions, that clearly you don't create. When you look at this lectern and don't imagine it, when you see it directly, when you look directly at me, or again, at the coffee mug, you're aware that you don't produce this idea. It is produced in your mind by an extraneous agency. But since we've established that it is minds that produce ideas, there must be a mind producing that idea in your mind. And those are what we have traditionally called the ideas of sense. Note, again, it's important to note that Berkley is working from a phenomenological level. What he is arguing is the way you distinguish whether you've produced an idea or have not really comes down to, do you feel that you voluntarily produced that idea? And secondly, you'll note that the ideas you produce are never as clear and distinct, to use the Cartesian language, or have the same sort of vivacity or power and detail as those which you don't produce. And again, you can take a useful experiment here. Look at the lectern, note its details, close your eyes, form the image in your mind, and see if it's nearly as detailed, and you'll find that it isn't. So that's a real distinction between ideas, is not those caused by sense and those caused by reflection, but rather those that are very clear and distinct and those that are not. And the conclusion of this is that there must exist another mind capable of producing all the ideas we claim to sense. Which is to say, all of the sensible world must be produced by a mind which places the ideas of that sensible world in our minds. But if we think about what such a mind would be, capable of such power and directness, that is precisely what we commonly call God. So Berkley feels that, in fact, empiricism, which we saw in Mandeville and others had been used to argue for irreligion, in fact, if deployed correctly, is the basis for an embracing of basic religious truths. This brings us to, of course, one of the famous quips in the history of Berkeleyan idealism, the famous story, if a tree falls in the forest and no person is there to hear it, does it make a sound? And critics had always thought that this was a great refutation of Berkeley, right? If no one's there to hear it, then there is no idea in the mind, therefore it doesn't make a sound. That's absurd. We expect that when trees fall in forests, they'll make a sound. But Berkeley actually has, I think, a fairly cogent answer to this. First of all, if the tree falls in the forest, it does make a sound. It makes a sound because there's always one mind present to experience it, and that is God. Right? If God was not present, there would be no sound, indeed. But neither would there be a tree or a forest. Right? God sustains the existence of all of these objects. And again, I want to stress this point over and over again, because traditional Christian teaching, which had been undermined by the Newtonian revolution and the Enlightenment, had been that God not only created the universe, which Newtonians could accept as a sort of watchmaker, but sustained its being at every moment. And Berkeley is demonstrating that, at least trying to demonstrate that in fact God does sustain the being of the universe by creating the ideas in our mind. And in a sense, we could think of God in this context as a sort of universal switchboard of ideas. Right? God is the source of the law-like regularity of our experience. He makes sure that when we think we perceive objects falling, they always accelerate at sea level at 32 feet per second squared. And again, Berkeley's point would be, when you see such law-like regularity, that should suggest not materialism or mechanism, but in fact intelligence. What are the odds that the universe would happen to follow the integral calculus and the infinitesimal calculus? That's a clear sign of intelligent design, and an intelligent designer, therefore, God. Okay. Well, where does this leave us with our understanding, then, of one of the other classic critiques of Berkeleyan idealism? And this was the one raised by Samuel Johnson. When Johnson was presented with the idealist position, Johnson said, "I refute Berkeley thus." And he kicked a stone and said, "There we go. I mean, I've had a physical experience." Well, I hope by now you get a sense of how Berkeley would have responded to that critique. You have an idea of your mind that there is a rock or lectern in front of you. You volitionally choose to strike out at that object, and then you feel, again, another sensual impression, that of pain in your toe. Does that prove, however, that there is a physical stone there? Not at all. That proves the law-like regularity of God's controlling that switchboard of ideas. Right? God realize that you voluntarily chose to strike out at what you thought was an object in front of you, or what you perceived to be an object in front of you, and therefore, according to the law-like regularity that God imposes on the universe, he produced that experience of pain in your toe. Okay. Well, why go through this intense metaphysical exercise? Well, there's a couple things I think Berkeley needs to establish. First, he is aware of the great prestige, importance, and achievements of Newtonian physics. And to argue against that would be, in fact, to argue himself into a very lonely position. So Berkeley's trying to produce an idealism that will account for Newtonian physics, but do so in a way that doesn't undermine deeper religious truths. So Berkeley's point is that Newtonian physics helps us predict experience. It shows us the law-like regularity of our sense impressions, but it doesn't actually explain anything. And this, again, I think is a very deep insight on Berkeley's part. The argument he's making is, if I inform you that objects accelerate downward at 32 meters per second square at sea level, and that that's because of certain laws of gravity, that doesn't, in fact, explain why those objects accelerate downward at 32 meters per second square. It simply gives us the laws which they follow. But why do they follow those laws? And even the physicist, at least at this point, doesn't have an answer yet. Are they gravity rays? Are they gravity particles? This was an intense philosophical problem. How does one explain action at a distance? So Berkeley's argument is that it doesn't really explain, it simply allows us to predict future experiences. Therefore, it's immensely useful, but hardly explanatory, and therefore you cannot build a materialist metaphysic on it. I point this out because this is not a position that Newton himself would have disagreed with. Newton was used to support materialism and mechanism, but Newton himself was an extremely pious Christian who spent the latter part of his work working on alchemy and revelations. So the Berkeleyan take on physics, then, is that it's of inestimable value in allowing us to predict future experiences on the basis of past ones. Yet it's unable to offer us any real causal account of what changes things in the world, and therefore really doesn't have any metaphysical significance. Right? And that's a very critical point because, again, as I stress over and over again, Newton had been used to support the more secular materialist worldview of the Enlightenment. Okay. Secondly, there's another reason Berkeley's going through all of these sort of metaphysical hoops, and that is that he thinks the belief in matter is in fact the cause of skepticism. And that cause of skepticism had in fact been part of the basis in supporting, if not atheism, at least agnosticism. If we can't be certain about the existence of the material world, how can we be certain about the existence of a divine realm? Now, why is the belief in matter the cause of atheism? Because it argues, the belief in matter, that we're separated from the real material world, the world of mass, by a veil of ideas, right? We have ideas, representations of objects, but they are not the objects themselves. And those ideas sort of mediate between us and the physical world. And that's exactly where Descartes had raised the problem of skepticism. How can we ever know that the ideas we have of objects correspond to the objects themselves? Right? We saw Galileo and Descartes develop this with respect to the distinction between primary and secondary qualities. We believe we see red in objects. We believe we perceive hardness or smoothness in objects. Yet the physicist and materialist insist that really all that's there is discrete quantities of matter with shapes in motion. And that color really is not something in the object itself, it's part of the way our retina reacts to light. And that, of course, produces that problem of skepticism. How do we know that all the rest of our experiences are not, in fact, distortions of what matter is really like? But by eliminating matter out of the loop, skepticism becomes an impossibility. Since all that exists are ideas, and since we have immediate access to them, unmediated by some veil, right, of representation, we can have absolute certainty about the nature, the objects of our knowledge, because they are in fact the very ideas that we phenomenally experience in an immediate sense. Okay. Thus, by eliminating a material world, a world beyond the realm of sense, skepticism becomes, in fact, a logical impossibility. And Berkeley, perhaps somewhat counterintuitively, but at least in his mind, believed that he was, in fact, arguing for common sense. That most people, when they thought about objects, actually believed those objects were the sum of their sense experiences, and didn't believe that there was some other realm deeper and more profound than those objects, which had different properties, purely mathematical properties. So Berkeley again sees himself as a champion not only of religious truth, but of common life, common sense, and common judgment. Again, Berkeley is clear that by producing skepticism, you are in fact producing atheism. And in his mind, at least, materialism is what promotes atheism, by positing this unknowable and, as he would argue, occult substratum to cause the experiences and regularities of our lives. And again, by occult he means a substratum which is posited to unify our sense experiences, but is itself never experienced. This is all the more troubling because these regularities actually issue from the mind of God. So there is not only a philosophical error in here, but there is a moral and spiritual error as well. Materialism commits us to endless metaphysical and epistemological wrangling. It commits us to disputes which we can never resolve, as Descartes himself showed. What idealism does is restores our common sense belief that our experience of the actual world is sound, that the world really is the way we experience it, full of colors and textures and odors. And it allows us to get beyond these dry metaphysical issues and turn to what are the really critical issues. And here I want to turn to the last passage in the concluding passage in Berkeley's famous treatise. For after all, what deserves the first place in our studies is the consideration of God and our duty, which to promote, as it was the main drift and design of my labors, so shall I esteem them altogether useless and ineffectual, if by what I have said I cannot inspire my readers with a pious sense of the presence of God. And having shown the falseness and vanity of those barren speculations which make the chief employment of learned men, the better dispose them to reverence and embrace the salutary truths of the gospel, which to know and to practice is the highest perfection of human nature. So we've seen that Berkeley, in fact, is, as a critic of the Enlightenment, criticizing it by adopting its very own phenomenological and empiricist assumptions. We've seen as well that he's able to use those assumptions to argue against materialism and on behalf of idealism. And finally, we saw that that allows him to try to recover what for him was endangered by the Enlightenment, the deep Christian piety and sense of moral virtue and duty that he saw as central to the Christian tradition. In conclusion, I'd like to make the following claim, and I think it's quite notable. Part of the power of the Enlightenment is even that its most profound critics and those who most clearly reject it, both in its assumptions and in its conclusions, find themselves forced to argue against it from within its own dialectical boundaries. Which is to say, with Berkeley we'll see critiquing the Enlightenment means showing logical consistencies within the Lockean tradition. Similarly, when we turn to Rousseau, we will see that rejecting the Enlightenment for him means arguing from within the social contractarian positions that had been established by Hobbes and Locke. And finally, it is also worth noting that if the Enlightenment produced reactions that led to great intellectual fruits, like idealism, and as we'll see, it's a very important doctrine in the 19th century, that's all the more reason to see its critical role in the history of Western thought.